Well, I appreciate your time, and the whole goal of this presentation is really to kind of map out what Microsoft is doing from a hybrid solution set. How many people are familiar with the term hybrid cloud? The hand's a little bit higher so I can see them. Get a good audience check. Perfect. So we're going to talk about hybrid cloud, but what really we're going to drive into is hybrid solutions. So when you talk about clouds, we're talking about an operating platform, all right? We're also going to talk about hybrid communications as well as collaboration. So really, we're going to walk through what Microsoft is doing right now from a solution stack perspective. So kind of the agenda for the presentation, and as Phil mentioned, it is going to be interactive because I want to ask you some questions and get some good information from you. We're going to focus on really two main areas, virtualization and data, and specifically we're going to dive down into Windows Server and System Center and how that's part of the whole hybrid cloud model, Azure and Intune, SQL 2014 from a data perspective, and then we'll jump into communications and collaboration, talking about Exchange and Link, SharePoint and Yammer, as well as Office 365. Does that sound like what you came for? Does that work? Okay, we good with that? So specifically with each one of these, I'm going to net out what functions that they're going to provide and how you can consume those, because I think what's happened what's happened up until this point is people go, well, I'm either going to have it on-prem or it's going to be hosted. Was that kind of a typical scenario, typical thought process? Well, the way that hybrid cloud works is the whole purpose is that you're both on-prem and in the cloud somewhere. Now that cloud may be a data center provider, a third-party provider. It could be Microsoft Azure. It could be Microsoft Office 365. It could be another type of solution. It could be Amazon Web Services. We'll talk about a lot of that. From a quick show of hands as well, from a Microsoft stack solution set, who is primarily running a Microsoft solution set stack in here? Okay, and that's when I say that, we're talking about, it could be servers, could be applications, could be ERP. They kind of still hit the same board. How many people are running a VMware from a data center and virtualization perspective, or that's kind of your focus? Right. Good. There we go. That helps me out. Appreciate that. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through that, because at the end of the day, this is a Microsoft tuned and focused presentation, but it's hybrid cloud. So that means you may have a VM solution or stack on site, and you may want to actually push that out to a Microsoft stack. Right? So this is really where all of this stuff is going to come together and work through. So specifically, I came up with this definition a couple years ago because the word cloud gets, everybody kind of bristles a little bit. Are you cloud? No. Have you gone cloud? You know, or I don't even want to talk about that anymore. My stuff's running. Stop talking to me about cloud. But the key thing when you say the word cloud specifically, and if you look at this definition up here, what this simply means is that in your operating environment, you have to be in multiple geographic locations. You have to be able to access those resources either singularly for each one of those resources or locations, as well as distributed. That's what cloud means, and you have to use a common connectivity medium. That could be the internet, that could also be MPLS or some other type of very available type of solution, charter, Metro E, whatever. So that's the focus of this conversation, is that when I say cloud, this is what I mean. Cloud is not a server blinking in a data center. It is a type of access and type of methodology. So the first thing that I'm going to dive into here is up until Windows Server 2012 R2, and as Phil mentioned, geeks. I'm a data center geek. I'm a communications geek. That's what I do. That's where I've spent the last almost 18 years in. Specifically here, Microsoft, I would say, would you say, first take when somebody says Microsoft, would your first thought be high availability when that came out? Probably not. You can shake your head, shake it up or down, either way, that's good. The reason I say that is because everybody is familiar with, I have to reboot my server. When you say reboot a server, would you think Microsoft or do you think Linux? Verbal responses are good too. So Microsoft, right? You don't typically reboot your Linux server. You're like, my Linux server's been up for 4 years. Really? Mine's been up 12. That's kind of been the methodology. What Microsoft has done and shifted with Windows Server 2012 R2 is that it's really kind of, they not only changed their compute model and how their hypervisor works, and we'll get into some of those terms, but what I want you to understand is these sites, whether it's Outlook.com, which was Hotmail, Xbox Live, Microsoft CRM Online, as well as BI, Power BI, Office 365, Bing, and all of MSN runs on Microsoft Hyper-V technologies, as well as Microsoft SQL technologies. So Microsoft is certainly eating what they cook right now. So when I want you to, when you look at Azure, Azure is all deployed on a Microsoft stack, right? At one point, who knew that actually Hotmail was running on a Unix platform? I knew that. It's pretty funny. Microsoft running their email on that, but they had to switch over to that for Outlook.com. So so what you see here driving forward is, specifically with Microsoft, is all of these technologies and everything that I'm going to discuss up here is built on multi-tenant, high availability, high performance, whether that's storage, whether that's software-defined networking, policy, and automation. Because I think when you're talking clouds, and you're talking about using them, not on just an operations perspective, but also how do I get from A to B? How do I actually extend that? How do I move? Automation and policy. And at the end of the day as well, the reason that you're building a cloud out is not because it's just a lot of fun, and it is, but the whole purpose of it is so that you're providing highly available applications and resources to your subscribers or your end users. So that's what the focus of this conversation is going to be. So one of the things I want to talk through specifically, when we look at from a hybrid cloud as a whole, the main things we're going to discuss is the cloud and data center infrastructure, and that's going to be things around Hyper-V. We're going to talk about business continuity, which is the data protection, offsite replication, service delivery. That's going to be a system center component that we're going to walk through on there, config manager, operations manager, orchestrator. And then we're going to talk about application management. Just to kind of give me a pulse, this one for applications management, this portion of it dives down into people that do a lot of their own custom development and push out a lot of applications. Who does that as part of their business in here? Okay, we've got a couple, about 4 or 5. So I'm going to tail into this, but if you want to dive into this a little bit more afterward, I'm happy to talk about it. But it's highly specific, and we're going to talk about development symmetry and platform symmetry. So that's kind of very specific with that. So if you look at, when you're talking about a cloud OS, so when Microsoft says a cloud operating system, they're really talking about an operating environment. And in order to do that, you're basically bringing a lot of components together. So that might be your server environment, might be your applications. But at the end of the day, as we mentioned, you're doing this to provide resources out to your end users. So in your businesses, if you actually had some type of self-service mechanism to where you could turn up solutions, well, that might be dev or test, right? It might be something that you just want to roll so somebody can test some things out. But would a actual self-service solution be of advantage to your business in trying to operate? And somebody says, hey, I need some more resources. It could be a developer that needs a SQL instance turned up. It could be an end user that needs more space. Having a policy and workflow is typically something, and you're talking about broad cloud build-outs, is something that's very important. The next step after self-service is obviously when somebody requests something, it has to be automated. You actually have to get some type of workflow response where somebody can approve that, and then things start happening. That's a big part of the system center process. And then from here, after you start that automation process, you determine where's that going to live. Is it going to be on-prem? Is it going to be on Microsoft Azure Office 365? Or is it going to be by a third-party service provider? A third-party service provider could be a hosting facility. It could be something like Amazon Web Services, as I mentioned before. And then, and this is kind of where you really get into the components of cloud. It's great that you can scale, right? It's great that we can create something on-prem. We can create something here. What about management? At the end of the day, you have to say, this worked. How do you determine if that worked if you don't have some types of metrics with that? So right now, you probably on-prem, you can get a really kind of a good feel for, yeah, my things are working. But when you push them out, let's say, how many people are using something in Azure or Amazon or Rackspace or something today? Okay, a couple. Do you get a good, and I'll ask you because you're in the front, so that's easy for me to do, so I'm not going to pick on you too much. But when you do that, do you get a very good combined view of what's on-prem and at Rackspace to where you can drive some intelligent metrics out of that?
Well, we're primarily using Amazon Web Services.
Okay.
Just for web applications.
Web applications? Okay.
We don't develop for clients.
Gotcha. Okay. So one of the challenges is when you have your internal metrics and you're looking at your business intelligence and your key performance indicators, it's generally different for what's on-prem than what it is in the cloud. So what I'm going to talk to you about with System Center, specifically this is going to be Operations Manager as well as Orchestrator with the service provider framework built into it, is how you can see from one unified pane of glass how those cloud environments are operating together, so that you can see how much load do I have in here, what's my response time in the cloud versus what's my in the public cloud versus private cloud, and those types of things. And this kind of brings it all together. So as I started mentioning components in here, you have everything from System Center with App Controller, Service Manager, Automation, Orchestrator, and as SPF, when you see that, that's your Service Provider Framework, all the tie-ins to whether it's Azure or a third-party system, and you really have all of these components that are built into that. And really what I kind of make mention of here is what Microsoft has done, which is why some of this stuff is much more available now. Originally, desktop operating systems were developed by a separate group, server operating systems were by a separate group, and System Center was by a separate group. So you had this misalignment of releases and misalignment of components and capabilities. What's happened by them bringing them all together to where you have tiered releases, it's allowed all of these to make sure that they align so that you're not getting out of sync with release steps. So I'm going to skip through, build this out, and then we're going to get to some of the meat of it. But essentially, with 2012 R2 and System Center together, essentially what you're looking at is the building of enterprise, world-class workloads and types of technologies scaled to being able to manage those in a simplified form and being able to have a full comprehensive management suite that actually gives you detailed views of that environment. So that's why when you hear Microsoft, the terms they use for this is management and virtualization. Essentially, they're tying all of this together because really, when you look at even doing a small on-prem Hyper-V implementation, you can do that, but if you want to get beyond that to actually build scalable clusters, you have to have the virtual machine management component, and so that all of these things do work together quite well. So kind of getting some technical details here. One of the things that I want you to see, and you can ignore the 2008 R2 because it was something that it could work, but for our customers and in our bases, it wasn't something that we would recommend for production unless you were very well in tune with Microsoft. With the 2000 R2 release, what you have is a complete linear capabilities with ESXi 5.5. The only difference is if you look under the host where you see virtual processors per host, you'll see where there's 2048 that can be on a single host. VMware can do 4096. Now, if you need more than 2048 virtual processors in your one host, you're doing pretty good, and I would like to talk to you and sell you some things. So just let me know after the fact. But specifically here, what this is showing you is, as far as scale and dynamic capabilities, they have redone the hypervisor to where it's fully capable for today's workloads. And what I will tell you, how many people have heard of PC Mall? Okay, they do a lot of business. A lot of their workloads are shifting over to, they have been running on a VM stack, but basically now they're needing SQL servers that have a terabyte of memory and some of these types of things to do a lot of their CRM processing. So now this is becoming much more, they're looking at that and saying, you know what, we can do that. How many people have heard of nested virtualization? All right, what a lot of people are doing now is they're taking a hypervisor like this, and let's say you have a VMware as your base hypervisor. They're nesting Hyper-V inside of VMware. Why would you do that? Well, if I want to shift an entire cloud and an applications group, it's a lot easier if I have that all inside another hypervisor that is very Microsoft stack aware. I've got my System Center and all of my other components that are tied in there. If I want to actually physically, that's a great way, and actually move that load over to another location, another geolocation, I can shift my entire compute components. And we can dive into some of the virtual networking and how that's possible, and some other manufacturers like Cisco that have overlay transport virtualization that can scale layer 2, layer 3. We'll get through some of that. If you want to dive into that, we can talk about it. But specifically speaking, that's where a lot of this is coming to. So as I mentioned, unified interface across clouds. And this is horrifically grainy, so my apologies. But what you could see there, if you could see it, would be everything from on-prem to different clouds such as Azure, as well as Amazon Web Services and a few others, that all those workloads are built into there. And what the key is, there's symmetry between them, and you can actually move and shift workloads between those on the fly. So I guess to build this slide out here, what you see, instead of having to log on to multiple panes of glass, you have full single sign-on, also full service visibility for application providers, as well as a VM and workload mobility. So now what I want to do is dive into some of the cloud features of this. And I want to ask them some questions. So when you hear of the term live migration, what does that mean to somebody? And Phil's got some things he's going to give you if you answer the questions, don't you, Phil? What does a live migration mean to you?
Still able
Absolutely. So we got a winner up here, Phil. We'll write that for later. So a live migration enables us to shift a workload without any downtime, right? So it enables us to continue to do business while we're moving something somewhere. What about storage tiering? Somebody else.
Where you have your higher grade storage or less.
You're on the right track. So it's
So that you can move stuff from a faster storage to a lower grade storage.
yeah. So you're tiering. You're putting the data at the right location for the right type of speed. It's called information lifecycle management, right? I want to be able to make sure that my specific data blocks are sitting on the right tier of storage. That might be solid state, that might be SAS, that might be nearline SAS, or a fourth tier that people have in their environments is tiering that storage out to Azure, to where they actually have an SMB connection out. We'll talk about what Store Simple is doing with that. SDN. I purposely put the acronym there so you could tell me what it meant. What's SDN? Starts with software, ends with networking. Software-defined networking. Thank you, Matt Fowler with Encore. Very good. You've actually learned something when I've talked before. Excellent. So software-defined networking, so this is simply saying I'm going to use policies, I'm going to use a piece of software to configure my network infrastructure. That may be VLANs, that might be quality of service, that may be VPNs, that might be a GRE tunnel. It means a great number of things, but essentially what I'm saying is I'm taking an automation process, and instead of me calling or talking to one of my network guys and say, all right, go in there to this, I want you to create a port channel group, and I want to make sure you use this type of hashing on the interfaces. Okay, and he might spend 30 minutes setting that up and testing it. Or through software-defined networking, I say, I need this application to perform this way based on what I've said it needs to be done. He goes, oh, you know what? I'm going to need more than a gigabit of communication. I'm going to need ether channeling. Based on that, and based on the fact that these are either 3850 switches or 6500 or something like that, I'm going to use this type of software, this hashing mechanism. So that's where SDN comes in. Central management, that's a gimme, okay? We all know what central management is. But essentially what that means is the ability to manage all of your clouds from one environment. And then multi-cloud. So this is something that I'm seeing a lot more of when you read, whether it's CRN, Gartner, or some of the other industry technology companies. They're talking about multi-cloud. That's an example of working in a multi-cloud would be, for example, VMware's vCloud Director, Cisco's Intercloud, and some of these other types of technology solutions, where basically it's a gateway between your clouds. So instead of you having to go, okay, I'm going to go out and create all these relationships, I'm going to figure out how to define workloads, where I want to put them, what's happening as part of all this, Microsoft has the System Center as their component of that. What I want to share with you what else is out there as well. It basically becomes that broker. So think of that as it's a broker to the cloud, whether that's Azure, whether that's another third party, AWS. So that's what multi-cloud is. So that's you running your entire infrastructure. You may be Hyper-V and VMware on site. We have a lot of customers that do VMware for all their servers, Hyper-V for all their VDIs, and using like Citrix Zen Desktop to push that out. And then they'll use multi-clouds for that. So that's the term multi-cloud. Are we on target so far? Is this good information? Okay. All right. So when we talk about a high-performance live migration, and that your information was exactly accurate, it's keeping everything online while you move data or workloads. So when we're talking about a high-performance migration, especially in the world of 10 gig, and what's happening with 10 gig right now, it's a brief rabbit trail. The cost, much like when you look at multi-core processors, a quad-core used to be ridiculously expensive. Now it's cheap. I mean, it's hard to find a 4-core processor now, right? It's becoming this way with 10 gig. 10 gig's becoming the norm. And not only is it faster, but it's easier to configure because we're using less ports. But if you look at, when you're talking about a 10 gig data center backplane, and we're able to do channeling of those network interface cards inside the servers, what you can see is speeds of up to 56 gigabits per second of transfer of data. So when you say, well, how fast is that going to move over? Is 56 gigabits fast enough? Probably so. If you need more than that, then you need to call NASA. I don't have much for you on that side. But 56 gigabits, so what that's simply saying is, if I've got a virtual machine that's running in this type of environment on this side over here, have a pointer on here, Phil? I bet I do. Oh, nope, that did it. But essentially, there we go. On the server workload on this side, we have a virtual machine that's running. If I want to actually have that move that data. The process that actually occurs is a couple-fold. And on one level, let's just say that I'm using a shared storage backend. So all I'm really moving is CPU, memory, swap file, and network. I can shift that at a high rate of speed. What if I need to move all the storage too? What if that virtual machine's actual physical hard drive, which in Hyper-V's case is a VHDX file, if I want to move that over there, having this type of speed, the 56 gigabits, is critical when I want to do what's called shared nothing. So in a hypervisor environment, the typical things you have to share are a common network plane and a common storage plane. In Microsoft's world, and what they're doing, what they've done with Windows Server 2012 R2, is they've built an environment called shared nothing, right? So they're saying is you don't need these expensive SANs anymore. Same manufacturer says lies. You know, there's truth to both sides of that, right? But the way that this works is it allows you to build your own scale-out file server system with Microsoft 2012 R2, as well as share nothing as far as the data is not sitting on the same storage spindles. You're sharing the same network, but you're able to translate that data over there. And then the key point, we talked about software-defined networking, is to have, when I'm setting this up, these pieces, Microsoft's view of where networking is going is that everything is going to be moving back to kind of a dumb L2 connection, right? So we're not going to have your software. So in switching, you have a control plane and a data plane. Data plane is where all your data is moving. Control plane is where all of the decisions get made, all right? So what Microsoft is saying is you're going to move all the control plane to System Center, and all your packets are just going to move on these quasi-dumb L2 switches that are simply taking config control from the top level. So that's really kind of part of the whole solution there. So storage sharing we talked about. That was a good answer back there, as well as what are we doing with the data. The word that you're going to use is hot data or hot blocks when you're moving data around. And essentially what we're saying is these types of environments have to have the ability to look and see, is this data highly active? If yes, I want to keep it at a top tier. If not, I'm going to move it down. I can even move it out to where it's in Azure. So a specific example of that is with the tragedy with the Boston Marathon bombings last year. A lot of the agencies there were now mandated. They had to keep the video data for some in 7 years, some forever. Well, how do you keep video data forever? Anybody do physical security in here? All right, there you go. Hey, Mark. So, Mark, how unique are these video data blocks? Can you dedupe them?
They're very unique. They watermark essentially
Yep.
the proper approach.
And in order for you to have a chain of custody and be able to submit those, all that data has to be unique, which means there's very limited data deduplication, very limited amount of compression that you can do. So what's happened in this case, they're like, well, how are we going to do this? Are we just going to spend another $100 million to store this data? Well, with a cloud architecture, and that's where Azure comes in, what they're able to do with a company called StoreSimple is that StoreSimple device has a tier of solid state. That's where all of your hot data is, okay, from a tiering perspective. They then have a larger disk, like nearline SATA, which would be 2-3 terabytes, and the third tier is Azure. So as that data ages out and isn't accessed, it gets copied out to Azure. So they can continue to expand that way. And the way that the Azure pricing models work, the more data you use, the less it costs. So for them, they were actually able to build predictive metrics about how scale is going to work from a storage perspective. But how this works for most of us today and why we're interested in that is when we're using let's say a SQL server, right? So in a SQL server, and traditionally speaking, only about 10% of the data that server has is hot at any time. That's typically your temp DBs and some specific transaction tables that may have a high amount of read-write. Well, then I don't want my whole SQL server sitting here because these are expensive disks. I would rather that sit down on actual hard disks, right, spinning spindles, and not burn the cost of my solid state drive. So that's what that tiering does, is it looks at that hot data and says, hey, I'm going to copy this up here. The other things we're going to go into today is with the new versions of SQL and Exchange, you now have what's called memory resident functionality or enhanced memory optimization, to where if you have a hot table or hot amount of data, instead of that ever even going to disk, it stays in RAM, right? Because RAM's getting cheap, right? And if you look at when you're moving data, if I need to move data from here to here, and I'm doing it in a typical environment, why don't I draw instead of using my hands? How about that? So if I've got data that's here, and let's say this is my SAN, can everybody see that well enough? All right, we'll just see the two sides of it. And if I've got servers that are here, so I've got a server block and I've got a SAN block. In order for me to move some data over here, if I want to shift that workload and it's on disk, I got to grab it from the SAN. So it's got to read, it's got to copy it, move it through the server, and then I'm coming back over here. So I have a lot of reads and writes that are occurring. If I'm memory resident, all that's going to do is memory to bus to network and over. And that SQL Server grabs it, bus to memory, right? So it enables a lot faster moves. Software-defined networking, we talked about this, so I won't stay on this too long. But essentially what I want you to see is the fact that you can not only configure local switching and those types of things, but it's also going to build out any type of VPN or type of connectivity that's necessary in order to be able to communicate with both your own cloud as well as potentially a partner cloud. Multi-tenant infrastructure, why this is important is if you actually are doing hosting, multi-tenancy is a very important thing. But also think of multi-tenancy this way. Do most of us have more than 2 departments in our companies? Usually. You might have 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, when you actually break those out and actually can have those run in separate so you can do chargeback, one of the biggest challenges has always been, well, okay, we're spending this much on technology. All right, well, how do we build that back to departments? I've got finance, I may have HR, I have all these types of things. How do I compartmentalize that? How can I give somebody more scale when they need it, but not penalize everybody else? So this is exactly where these types of meterings and multi-tenancy comes in. So as a part of all that, and I'm going to build this slide out here real quick, what we're saying here is whether you're using VMware vSphere as your local hypervisor, whether you're using Windows Server 2012 as your local hypervisor, whether you're copying it out to Azure, whether you're communicating, whatever cloud that you're using, the whole point of this is to be able to have a single interface where I can say how my compute load's doing, right? From a customer perspective in here, from a workload perspective, is everybody contained within your company, or do you actually have mobile workers? Mobile workers, great. There's a lot of mobile workers here. That's kind of how the industry works. Specifically, when you look at mobile workers, one of the challenges then you have to say is, all right, if I'm running all private cloud, I got to open everything back up internally, right? I've got to have firewalls, I've got to have VPNs, I've got to have secure communication. Microsoft's making it a little easier with something called direct access. That's an auto VPN that's built into Windows Server as well as the clients, to where if you're trying to connect to an internal resource, that'll automatically tune that up, so that makes it a little bit easier. But still, if you're having truly a mobile workforce that can be anywhere in the globe or anywhere in the country, you still have some caveats and things you have to think about. When you look at why would you move something to a public cloud, if you have a large mobile workforce and I have my data is here, but that data can be accessed typically via some type of web mechanism or a thin client or an app, what I can do is I can take that, I can still have it running here locally, but I can ship that data up to Azure as well. I can have some web servers spun up there. I can actually have all my mobile users based on DNS, simple pointer, external, different pointer, internal, and I'm able to access those environments differently. So that's when you look at it, why would I do that? There can be security implications for it, there can be speed, there can be high availability implications for it, to where you can shift some liability to Microsoft. Business continuity, so that's kind of the next portion of this that comes into it. So when you're talking about when you're building out your cloud or building out your data center, the reason, what is a main reason, and I'll stop and I'll ask a question, what is a main reason why you stopped building everything out on single servers that you would buy from Dell or HP and decided to potentially virtualize or build out a data center? What would be one of the main points of doing that? So hardware failure, and that's a high availability issue, right? And that's also a cost issue, right? So as I'm paying for support 24/7 by 2 hours in some cases, or 4 depending on what your environment is, you can have a lot of burn there. Well, if you look at it from a business continuity perspective, not only are you able to provide high availability with this type of cloud model, but also business continuance. So in the event that you actually have your data center go offline, that could be a power outage, could be a utility cut. Bubba likes to get on the backhoe and tear things up. We've all dealt with that. I've been in Atlanta when half the city went down, right? What do you do? Right? Well, that's where mobile comes in. All right, how do I get access to my data? Well, if you already had it up in Azure or some third-party cloud where you could either turn it up or just simply access it, you wouldn't care as a company. You can keep on turning and doing business. Where everybody else goes, man, I really hope this comes up soon, right? And during failure, if you're not able to provide the service that your business is doing, that's when your competitors go, hey, I can provide service. I'm not in Atlanta. I don't have that problem. Well, let me start buying from you. So there's all these implications as far as specific business continuity and those types of things go. I'll quickly breeze through this. Basically, the premise around this is, how many people have run out of hard drive space ever? None of us, I know. So what happens here, especially in a server workload environment, I'll ask this question, because this is something that happens frequently. How many times have you said, hey, I'm just going to turn something up for test or dev, just to see if it works, and then it somehow went production on you? Pretty frequently, like, oh, it works well. All right, let's go. Wait a second, I put this up here. I didn't plan it out. No, we're ready. Go ahead, let's light this sucker up. What this allows you to do is say, all right, well, originally, I had this on this server here. I only did a 100 gig hard drive. Now, based on the data input, I need a terabyte, right? Oh no, don't take that offline. Don't take it offline. We already have orders coming in. Well, now what am I going to do? You know, am I going to clone this? How do I tier this? How do I change networking? Well, that's what this is for. So basically, it allows you to not only expand the storage, but also allows you to migrate and move it into different locations. So replication. Essentially, all we're talking about here is a VM or a hypervisor level replication, where I can take that entire VM and I can have a replicant copy of it sitting on another cluster internally, another cloud. That can be Azure, as I mentioned, it can be AWS. But essentially, I don't need this to be a part of, I don't have to buy a storage array that does this. I don't have to have a third-party piece of software that does this. This is all native to Hyper-V, and it's literally as simple as this. I have this Hyper-V server here. I have this Hyper-V server over here. There's a little click box that says Hyper-V Replicator. I say, you're the source, you're the destination. I right-click on the VM, and I say, start replicating or schedule. Pretty straightforward, right? This is something that Microsoft has really worked a lot on. And then simplified and orchestrated VM recovery. So let's say that now that I'm doing my offsite replications, I'm doing my offsite backups, I've got all of that working, right? I have a disaster, I fail over. One of the hardest things to do is to fail back. How do I then rehydrate all this data now that's updated over here? I need to rehydrate that into my production environment and bring this back on. And that's where these VM recovery tools work in as far as replication, pulling that VM data back in, pulling the backups back in, and being able to flip back to your main production data center. This just simply walks you through that failover. We talked about this, so I'm going to skip past this. What this is walking you through, and we already accessed some of this, but this is that self-service model I was telling you about. So I'm connecting in. I need to access a resource. I hit the catalog. The request comes in. I approve the request. Then what's called a run book then kicks off inside of System Center Orchestrator. And let me tear that out real quick. So within System Center, kind of your main components, you're going to have Config Manager, you've got Operations Manager, and you've got Orchestrator. Right? Those are kind of the main ones that you'll use as far as automation. And virtual machine management ties in to manage your hyperstacks. But what this does is this kicks off a runbook inside of Orchestrator that then, after the approval, builds out whether it is a SharePoint server, whether it's a SQL server, whatever that happens to be, creates the instance, and then we move right into provisioning the service, and that's Microsoft VMM. That's the view there. And then that service gets provisioned, and now we're online. So simply that's kind of how that process walks through from an orchestration perspective. So we talked about this already. It has to be a consistent management experience, whether you're using on-premise cloud or Microsoft or a service provider. Multi-tenancy are very, very important. So to kind of take a step back here, this is when I was asking earlier about applications and if your company does a lot of specific development. What this actually allows you to do, it's called developmental symmetry. Whether you're using on-premise to deploy your applications to a stack, whether you're using cloud or Azure, what this allows you to do is you're saying, hey, I have consistency in my builds. I don't have to create this for this type of medium. I move this over my hosting environment. It's a little bit different. It allows you to completely provision your applications and deploy your environment no matter where you're at. And then, of course, manage those applications. So not only we talked about management of simply servers, workloads, clouds, and those types of things, but it's also application management. When you deploy an application, how important is it that you know if it's actually responding correctly, right? We saw Mitel in here and voice specifically. So when you're deploying a voice solution, you actually have to know, am I having failed registrations, right? Or do I actually have issues where people can't get into my environment and be able to predictively fix that? So whether it's a voice app, whether it's a specific application, those are very important things to understand, that there's agents that are built into these virtual environments that can provide that feedback. So program symmetry, I talked a little bit about this a second ago. Visual Studio, and whether, as I said, you're pushing this to a local or a Azure cloud, it has to be consistent across the board, and these technologies provide that. And I won't go way down into that. Mobile device management. Who has a challenge with managing devices? Who has mobile devices here? Okay. If you're actually doing that in a business structure, actually getting data and applications to that is a big deal. One of the things Microsoft has done, building with System Center 2012 R2 Config Manager, is it's tied into a cloud-based solution called Windows Intune. Windows Intune essentially becomes your cloud-based mobile device manager. So System Center, so picture this with me. All right, I built my private cloud. I've got my servers. All right, I've got this now that exists both on-premise, and let's just use Azure as an example. So I've got my fully hybrid cloud built. Now I'm deploying my applications. All right, I got my applications I deployed over here. I deploy them over here. Now how do I get that to my device? Now if it's web-based, that can be a little bit more simple, right? I send people a link to it. What if I actually want to push an application down to them? What if I want to be able to say, hey, this is your personal device, but I want to be able to sandbox something over here and push a app or something down to there that I want to keep separate from your own personal device? This is where all of this ties into. So that's Microsoft's solution for this. Is not, System Center is not just for servers and workloads and infrastructure as a service and policy management purely from a cloud or app perspective, but it's also for the actual device that you're connecting from too. And that's both, and this works both for Windows, Android, and iOS. I'll skip through this, but this is basically just kind of nets that out for you and shows you what's fully supported through there to where you can provision your devices. So with Windows Server and Windows System Center, why would you choose to do that? We already talked through all of these. This is just a summation of that, and this is more for when you get the slide later. Let you take a quick look at why specifically. Again, mapping it to large-scale deployments, simple, cost-effective, easy to manage, and applications-focused. So what's new to Azure right now? So this is something that's just coming out, is full automation from not just from System Center, but be able to build out your full runbooks, full remote apps. So if you use RDP as an application, you can now do that from Azure. You can simply have your whole RDP stack that sits up in Azure, so you don't have to run all those servers internally. And then Windows Azure files, so you can actually use and mount storage that's sitting in Azure via SMB right off your hosts. So this is SMB 3.0. This is a brand new CIFS protocol that allows you to essentially think of it a drive mapping or a data mapping. This is exactly what that is, except that storage sits in Azure. A lot of these technologies are what's built into OneDrive as well. So moving out of specifically just talking about servers, 2012 R2, System Center, and those types of things, I want to give you a little bit of an update on SQL 2014. The reason I have up here it's optimized for virtualized clouds is the way that Microsoft is developing everything moving forward is it's built so it's indifferent whether it's on-prem or from the cloud. Generally speaking, prior to this, you had a version of something that would run here, then you have a slightly different version that you'd have to run from a cloud scenario perspective. What this allows you to do, and all of the management interfaces and everything is built into here, is this allows you to actually embrace all of that. So as I mentioned with the memory optimization, right? So if I'm moving data, if I'm communicating back and forth between a cloud, I don't want to get penalized on my IOs per second or IOPS when I'm reading from disks. I want to yank it out of memory, and I want to be able to shift that load. Same thing from a data file, what we talked about with the Azure file, as well as being able to host a database directly from your management console for SQL Server 2014. So I can actually go in there and connect to Azure, build databases up there, and work through that. And that's where I can set up replication and those types of things. Some specific always-on enhancements. I won't detail too far down into this, but as far as being able to much more cost-effectively fail back and forth and having a wider spread load. If you look at the replicas, so if you run a large database application, instead of having 4, you now have 8, and you can actually continue to work. Because typically speaking, in a clustered environment, you have a quorum, and a quorum is basically can be a specific server or a file location where everybody checks in and checks out and says, hey, I'm alive, I'm good. Well, you have instances where if you may have trouble with that location, you don't want everybody just to disengage and stop working, so you can continue to work in that. And then delayed durability, and think of it like a delayed write. So you actually can get, When I'm having a client-server relationship and I'm writing to a database, I simply want to say I want to continue to work and run, even though that hasn't actually been written to disk yet. My SQL Server will let me proceed. So Exchange. So when we're talking again clouds, and I mentioned that we're talking about hybrid solutions, we talked about cloud, we just talked about data, and now we're talking about Exchange, or the communications portion of this. So Exchange 2013 has shifted extensively from, before with Exchange you had roles and you would separate out roles and these servers would communicate a different way. Well, one of the things that Microsoft saw was happening was, well, I've got a user and they're coming in here and they're hitting this CAS, or this client access server. And then their mailbox server's over here, so they're going to grab data from there. And then once they're there, if they're pulling it from their if they have voicemail, or they're using the voicemail capabilities of that, unified communications of Exchange, they're then hitting the UC server over here. So essentially what I have is I have a user that's hitting 3 to 4 servers just to access something. That's silly. Why don't we make it to where we have full symmetry from how when that user's accessing something, everything's happening locally, so it's all in memory, it's all quick. And then if I needed to shift that whole environment, I just have to move that entire server instead of trying to shift roles and users and mailboxes and all of those types of things. So that's when you see server role evolution. I talked a little bit about the networking layer improvements already. Memory caching and user affinity is what I just talked about. And because everything is more driven through memory now, your IOs are significantly reduced across the board. It's a pretty detailed slide. Essentially what it's saying with 2013 specifically is it's going to with geo affinity essentially means if I'm here and I've got a server that's here, I'm going to make sure that I locate that user where it's supposed to be, which matters in a hybrid cloud, right? If I've got Exchange 2013 on-prem and I've got Office 365, but I have this at a couple different locations, I have to be able to be able to put my users at the right location based on where they're at. So it's a very important component of that. And some specific new features, and I'll just call out some important ones. SharePoint, is that an important component to everyone in here? Do you have SharePoint environments? A little bit maybe? What this does is it has a full integration with SharePoint, and the caveat here is it all has to be the latest server revs in order for that to work. But total integration from your Outlook client for SharePoint and Exchange, if you look down here, it's a single interface now for e-discovery. So from a single point, whether that's Outlook or that's the Outlook web app, I can do a search for all of my email, all of my SharePoint data, and all of my link communications. So it's very, very important to understand that, and the reason that is so key is if I have data that's sitting in multiple locations, that all has to be queryable. So this is kind of a basic overview as far as mailbox growth goes. I talked to Artie about the user affinity side. I mean, basically what Microsoft is determining is that everybody is going to soon have 100 gig mailboxes, so they've optimized their Exchange environment for that, as well as Office 365. Office 365 specifically, so this is Microsoft's version of providing Exchange, Office, SharePoint, and Link from the cloud. Do we have any Office 365 users? Okay. Are you in a are you in a hybrid mode, or are you in a full deployed Office 365 mode, a native mode? Native mode? Native? Hybrid? Okay. This is, for a lot of our customers, the majority of them run in a hybrid mode. We work a lot with public sector and commercial, but in a public sector aspect, a lot of higher ed and K-12, they'll run a lot of the staff and the administration local, but push all the students out there. And we have environments where users, 25,000 to 50,000 users that we build and migrate, and this is a perfect platform for that. Well, what I want to show you here is the next versions of Exchange is going to be called Office 365 on-prem. So you kind of see where all of this is going, right? It's not going to be an Exchange environment here or an Office 365 here. They already have a fully unified management interface to be able to control and push mailboxes. Right now there's a little bit separate management for Office 365, but in the next step there won't be that at all. Link, so Microsoft Link is their solution that does instant messaging and presence, which is chatting, which is knowing if that user's in a meeting, if they're on the phone, as well as integration with calendaring, with Exchange Online, as well as messaging, to where you get a fully unified, whether it's instant messaging, whether it's an email that you want to use, or SharePoint tie-ins. And then the Office 365 Pro Plus essentially is your Office from the cloud. Instead of you having to push and use Office, they can actually get that and stream that down. So Microsoft has some guiding principles that they use with Office 365, but this is with Azure as well. Essentially, the best overview of this is this. They have, and I think it's actually in, I'm going to skip forward here, if that's okay. I'll get back to this in a second. So what Microsoft has done as part of their building their cloud out, not just specific certifications and compliances, but it's also the amount of engineers and people that were involved in building their cloud out. What I want to kind of get to with some of this, then I'll pop back and I'll go through SharePoint and Yammer, then we'll wrap it up. But specifically is when you're looking at building your cloud model out, you can have a trust factor with Microsoft simply because the amount of intelligent people that were working on it, the amount of effort they put into it, and the securities and compliances that are based in the whole solution. So I'm going to pop back to this real quick. So SharePoint 2013, basically a brand new overview, as well as Yammer tie-in. So how many people have heard of Yammer? Okay. Oh, actually, it's a good many. That's probably the most I've ever had in any group that I talked to. Congratulations. What's interesting about this tool is that it started off, basically, it is a cloud-only service unless you have more than 10,000 users on-prem. And you can actually get an on-prem version of this. But if you're 10,000 users and less, everything has to be from the cloud. But specifically what this does, this is kind of like that final aggregator in more of that conversational type flow between Exchange, SharePoint, and Link. So what you can do here as part of all this, and as I mentioned, the tie-in to do e-discovery as part of all of this, what's happening is this is becoming an aggregator. So think with SharePoint, it's kind of that platform, but then Yammer is the conversational and social overlay of that. You essentially are not only managing documents from here, it's actually going to trend and see who's accessing them. It's going to work through some specific line items around, hey, you're talking about this project, I'm going to grab that and I'm going to pull it from your email thread or from your link thread, I'm going to pop that into the conversation. Some challenges that we have at times is, let's say that we've got a project that we're doing for a customer. What if that engineer is on vacation now, but they shot them a bunch of emails last week to tell them something, we're not sure what they said. Well, if we actually have that tied in here, we don't have to go looking through their inbox while they're gone. We can simply pull that up as part of the Yammer flow. So specific feature sets, right? I'm going to skip back one here. As far as what Yammer is capable of, this is already here because this is a little bit older slide. So external communications, being able to tie. So let's say that you're working on a project, and a construction company is a good example of this, or an architect, in that you need to share documents. You also need to have conversations about revisions, changes, and those types of things. You can invite them into that specific conversation to where they can then communicate, to where you can have full running feedback of, why did we make this change? I don't remember. Did we have a phone call? What was the purpose of that? Gives you that whole running dialogue of that project and really allows you to go back in time to be able to figure out what's happening. As I mentioned, the email integration and enhanced messaging, and the whole point of this, it says Office 365 single sign-on, but the whole point of a cloud stack is so that you only have one, have to have one user ID. I don't need a user ID in my Active Directory, Office 365, Azure, over here, other applications. I want to be able to federate and consolidate all of that, and that is what the Microsoft Cloud Stack provides. So we ran through this slide just to give you that overview, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for staying awake. Do you have any specific questions that you want to ask? And this is something we can take it offline if you want to, or anything that you may want to go through?
The hypervisor application, VM, do you have anything to help with application system checkpoints as it replicates across?
Yeah, so what he's mentioning is, at times, when when you're doing an update and you're moving something over, what's occurring is the application is still writing on the side that's the source. Well, when you're replicating that over, that's a replicant that's frozen in time. So if you have a failure before that next replication, you lost whatever time and hours in there. So it could be 4 hours, 8 hours. So he's talking about how do you actually go back and sync that update and the application consistent data over there, and whether that's SQL driven or whether that is some other type of application. So there are some third-party tools that will do that. What they'll do is you actually run a live replicant over there. And what we found in some cases is, when you're specifically talking about SQL and or some databases that are file-driven, what we found is that instead of using that Hyper-V replicator, what we'll actually do is have another server tuned up over there that's in like a SQL log shipping capacity or file replication to where we use that as opposed to the Hyper-V replicator. But there are some third-party software that we'll tie in there that will manage that. Because what will occur is you have your hypervisor-based replication with what you're asking, then you actually have a third-party application that's actually doing that data sync over there, and when you tune that up over here, it will rehydrate that with the new data. Yeah?
When you mentioned live resizing of the virtual disk, does that also apply to your boot drive as well?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the entire hard drive. So if you think of your C drive where your MBR, your GPT volume is, you essentially can resize the entire thing. Well, great. Phil, it's all yours.
A round of applause.